Coffee burns on the hot plate, smelling like charred earth and exhaustion. Debt collectors breathe down your neck, leaving voicemails that sound like scraped metal. You're one missed shift away from sleeping in a rusted sedan with a terrified younger brother. Nora thought whispering her most desperate, impossible prayer to an empty diner at 3 a.m. was just a way to keep from screaming. She was wrong, because the man in the corner booth wasn't just a customer. He was a king of the underworld, and he just found his alibi: grease and cheap lemon bleach. That was the perfume of Nora's existence. She rubbed the heel of her hand against her sternum, trying to massage away the dull, persistent ache that had taken up permanent residence behind her ribs. The diner's overhead fluorescence flickered, a relentless, insectoid hum that bored directly into the base of her skull. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. The kind of hour where only the displaced, the drunk, and the dangerous sought refuge over stale cherry pie and lukewarm drip coffee. Nora shoved a damp rag across the cracked formica of the counter, collecting sugar granules and a smeared puddle of ketchup. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick, the cuticles frayed and bleeding slightly from the dry winter air. She didn't feel the sting. She hadn't felt much of anything besides panic for the last 3 weeks. Her phone vibrated in the pocket of her mustard-yellow apron. The heavy canvas weighed down on her neck. Pulling the cracked screen free, she stared at the caller ID. Arthur Penhaligon, attorney at law. Bile rose in the back of her throat, tasting like the antacids she chewed for dinner. She ducked behind the pie display case, pressing her back against the humming refrigerator compressor. The vibrations seeped through her cheap cotton shirt. "Mr. Penhaligon," she answered, her voice coming out as a dry rasp. She cleared her throat. "Tell me you got an extension." "Nora." The lawyer's voice was thin, reedy, utterly devoid of sympathy. It was the voice of a man checking a box on a Tuesday night before pouring his scotch. "There are no more extensions. The terms of your grandfather's trust were ironclad. I warned you about this 6 months ago." "I know what you warned me about," Nora snapped, squeezing her eyes shut. The red glow of the neon open sign bled through her eyelids. "But the bank gave me until the end of the month. The bank reviewed the deed today. Your 25th birthday is Thursday. The stipulation clearly states you must be legally wed by your 25th birthday to claim the estate and the attached accounts. If you are not, the assets default to the secondary beneficiary, your uncle, and your uncle has already signed the paperwork to liquidate the house to cover his gambling debts." A cold sweat broke out across Nora's collarbones. She gripped the edge of the aluminum counter so hard her knuckles popped. "My brother is asleep in the manager's office right now because we can't afford the heating bill at the house, Arthur. Toby is 8. If my uncle sells the house, child services will take him. I just need the trust money to pay off the arrears. Give me a month." "You need a marriage certificate by tomorrow afternoon, Nora, filed and stamped by the county clerk, or the foreclosure initiates Thursday morning." A heavy sigh filtered through the receiver. "I'm sorry, truly. But unless you find a husband by tomorrow, you and your brother are out on the street. Have a good night." The line went dead. Nora didn't throw the phone. She didn't scream. The movies always got desperation wrong. True desperation wasn't loud. It was a suffocating, paralyzing weight. It felt like being trapped under a frozen lake, watching the shadows walk above the ice while your lungs burned. She slid down the front of the refrigerator until her cheap, slip-resistant shoes hit the sticky linoleum. Pulling her knees to her chest, she pressed her face into her apron. It smelled faintly of old meat and vanilla extract. She couldn't breathe. Short, shallow gasps tore at her throat. Her chest hitched violently, an ugly, wet sound clawing its way up her windpipe. She had 24 hours to find a man willing to legally tether himself to a waitress drowning in back taxes, just to save a rotting 2-bedroom house and a little boy with asthma. It was a joke, a sick, cosmic joke. Nora shoved the heels of her palms into her eye sockets until sparks burst in her vision. She forced her lungs to expand, swallowing down the copper taste of fear. Crying wouldn't pay the rent. Crying wouldn't keep Toby out of foster care. She grabbed the edge of the counter and hauled herself upright. Her knees popped in the quiet diner. Grabbing the coffee pot, she stepped out from behind the display case. There was only one customer left in the building. Booth 4, deep in the back shadows, where the overhead light had burned out 3 weeks ago, and the manager refused to replace the bulb. He had been sitting there for 2 hours. He hadn't touched his black coffee. Nora didn't know his name, but she knew his type. The heavy, dark wool of his tailored overcoat was draped immaculately over the cracked vinyl of the booth. Underneath, a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her grandfather's entire estate. He sat with a stillness that made the hair on Nora's arms stand up. Predators didn't fidget. They waited. She walked over, the rubber soles of her shoes squeaking faintly. "Warm up?" she asked, her voice entirely flat. She didn't have the energy to fake the customer service smile. Not tonight. The man slowly lifted his head. His eyes were a startling, washed-out grey, like the sky right before a blizzard. They locked onto hers with a heavy, physical weight. He didn't look at her like a man looking at a waitress. He looked at her the way an architect looks at a load-bearing wall, calculating exactly how much pressure it could take before it cracked. "No," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough around the edges, entirely devoid of warmth. It smelled faintly of ozone, peppermint, and something distinctly metallic. Gun oil. "You look like you're going to pass out." Nora stiffened, clutching the glass handle of the coffee pot like a weapon. "I'm fine. Do you want the check?" "I heard your phone call." The words were spoken softly, but they hit Nora like a physical blow. The diner was small, the acoustics terrible, but she hadn't realized her voice had carried. Heat flushed her cheeks, a jagged spike of humiliation piercing through her numbness. "That's none of your business," she snapped, her chin tilting up defensively. She reached for the small green checkbook in her apron. "Your total is $3.50. You can pay at the register." She spun on her heel, desperate to escape those flat, analyzing eyes. But her shoe caught the edge of a ripped floor mat. Her ankle twisted sharply. The world tilted. The glass coffee pot slipped from her sweaty grip. It hit the linoleum and shattered with a violent, deafening crash. Boiling dark liquid exploded outward, splashing across her shins, burning through her thin jeans. Nora dropped to her knees amidst the steaming puddle and jagged glass shards. The dam broke. It wasn't a graceful breakdown. Snot ran from her nose. A harsh, ugly sob ripped out of her throat, echoing in the empty diner. She grabbed a handful of napkins from a nearby table and slammed them blindly into the coffee puddle, slicing her thumb on a piece of glass. Dark crimson welled up, mixing with the brown liquid. "Damn it!" she choked out, her voice cracking, completely ignoring the blood. "Damn it all!" She scrubbed at her face with the back of her dirty, bloody hand, smearing coffee and tears across her cheeks. The exhaustion was a physical, crushing weight, pinning her to the floor. "I can't do this," she whispered to the empty air, her shoulders shaking with violent, jerky tremors. "I can't. I need a husband by tomorrow. I need a miracle. I need a goddamn way out." She waited for the silence to swallow her words. She waited to be alone in her misery. Instead, a shadow fell over her. Expensive Italian leather shoes stopped an inch from the broken glass. A crisp, white linen handkerchief was thrust into her peripheral vision. Nora looked up, her breathing hitched, tears blurring the harsh angles of the man's face. "You need a husband," the man from booth 4 said, his voice entirely conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "And I need a wife. Get up." Nora stared at the pristine white square of fabric dangling from the man's large, calloused hand. A drop of blood from her thumb fell onto the linoleum, a bright red dot against the spilled coffee. She didn't take the handkerchief. "Are you insane? Or just an asshole trying to be funny?" She rasped, her voice thick with unshed tears and sudden, defensive anger. She scrambled backward, her hand slipping slightly in the mess. "Because if this is a joke, I am really not in the mood." The man didn't blink. He crouched down, ignoring the puddle of coffee seeping toward his $1,000 shoes. Up close, the sensory details of him were overwhelming. He didn't smell like the diner. He smelled heavily of cedarwood, cold rain, and an underlying scent of raw, unfiltered danger. His face was a study in harsh geography. High, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw shadowed with dark stubble, and a small faded scar cutting through his left eyebrow. But it was his eyes that held her in place. They were terrifyingly empty of empathy. "My name is Julian." He stopped himself. "My name is Dominic Costa." He stated the name, like she should know it. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the panic of her impending homelessness, a small alarm bell rang. Costa, the Costa family. You didn't grow up on the south side of the city without hearing whispers of the syndicates that ran the docks, the unions, and the quiet, blood-stained streets. Nora swallowed hard, the dryness in her throat making it painful. "I don't care who you are. Leave me alone." Dominic reached out. His movements were slow, deliberate, telegraphing exactly what he was doing so she wouldn't flinch. He wrapped the handkerchief around her bleeding thumb, pressing down with firm, steady pressure. His fingers were warm, rough as sandpaper against her cold skin. "I don't make jokes, Nora," Dominic said. He knew her name. He had read it off her plastic name tag. Or maybe he just knew. "And I'm not trying to be funny. You need a marriage certificate by tomorrow to secure an inheritance and keep custody of a child. I heard enough. Stop listening to my conversations," she hissed, trying to pull her hand away. His grip tightened just enough to prevent it, not enough to bruise. "I have a problem of my own," Dominic continued, his voice an even, rhythmic hum that somehow cut through the chaotic buzzing of the fluorescents. "I am finalizing the acquisition of a very large, completely legitimate logistics corporation on Friday. The board of directors is old money, conservative, and entirely skittish. They don't like my reputation. They view me as a liability, a wild card." He released her hand, leaving the handkerchief wrapped around her thumb. He stood up, towering over her, buttoning the center button of his suit jacket. "My advisors have told me that projecting stability is paramount to closing this deal," Dominic said, looking down at her. "A wife, a settled home life, a clear indication that I am transitioning from my past into respectable corporate society. I needed to find someone by the end of the week. You need someone by tomorrow. The timing is violently efficient." Nora stayed on the floor, surrounded by broken glass. Her mind raced, a jagged, fragmented mess. This was absurd. This was the kind of fever dream brought on by sleep deprivation and trauma. "You want me to marry you," she said flatly. "A mob boss, for optics. I am a businessman," Dominic corrected, though the deadpan delivery didn't erase the lethal edge in his tone. "And yes, I require a legally binding piece of paper, a few public appearances, and absolute discretion. In exchange, I will ensure your grandfather's trust is unlocked." And he reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket, withdrawing a sleek, black leather money clip. He peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills and dropped them onto the dry section of the counter above her. "That is for the coffee pot and your ruined clothes. If you agree, I will wire $50,000 into a private account in your name the moment the ink is dry on the marriage certificate, as an advance on your services." Nora's breath hitched. $50,000. It was a number so large it felt fictional. It would pay off her uncle's loan sharks immediately. It would fix the boiler at the house. It would buy Toby his asthma inhalers without her having to skip meals for a week. She looked from the money to Dominic's impassive face. "Why me?" she asked, her voice shaking now. "You have money. You have power. You could find some gorgeous model, some socialite to play pretend." Dominic's expression tightened infinitesimally. A flicker of something dark and exhausted crossed his grey eyes before vanishing. "A socialite asks questions. A model wants the spotlight. I don't want someone who wants to be in my world. I want someone who wants exactly nothing to do with me, someone who views this as purely transactional. You are desperate. Desperate people follow instructions, and they don't get romantic delusions." The insult stung, a sharp slap of reality. He wasn't saving her. He was buying her. Nora grabbed the edge of the counter and pulled herself up. Her ankle throbbed fiercely, but she forced herself to put weight on it. She looked him dead in the eye. "I'm not a prostitute," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its tremor. She was terrified, yes, but the South Side had taught her how to negotiate when backed into a corner. "I didn't ask for one," Dominic replied smoothly. "The marriage will be unconsummated. We will reside in the same house for appearances. You will have your own wing. You will attend 2 charity galas and 1 dinner with the logistics board. You will smile. You will wear the rings I purchase. In 12 months, we will file for a quiet, irreconcilable differences divorce. You keep the house, the trust, the $50,000, and a monthly stipend we can negotiate tomorrow." It was a contract. Cold, clean, and utterly devoid of humanity. Nora looked toward the back hallway. Through the cracked door of the manager's office, she could see a small, worn sneaker sticking out from the edge of the folding cot. Toby. He had coughed twice during her shift already. If she walked away, Child Protective Services would be at her door by 5 p.m. tomorrow. She turned back to Dominic. The scent of danger around him was palpable. Being tied to a man like this was a death sentence in its own right. He was violent, calculating, and lived in a world where people ended up at the bottom of the river for minor infractions. But tomorrow was certain doom. Dominic Costa was merely potential doom. "My brother," Nora said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Toby, he's 8. He comes with me. Wherever you live, he gets his own room. Safe. Away from whatever it is you actually do." Dominic tilted his head, a microscopic adjustment of calculation. "Agreed. He will be provided a tutor and full security detail. I don't want your blood money mixing with his life," she added fiercely. "You don't talk to him about your business. You don't use him for optics. He will be kept entirely separate from my operations," Dominic stated. He reached into his pocket again and produced a matte black business card with a single silver phone number embossed on it. He slid it across the counter, right next to the cash. "Pack your things," Dominic said, turning his back on her. He didn't ask if she agreed. He already knew. The trap was perfectly designed. "A car will be outside your residence at 8 a.m. We are getting married at 10 a.m. at City Hall. Wear something that doesn't smell like bleach." He pushed open the heavy glass door of the diner. The bell jingled merrily, a sickeningly cheerful sound in the heavy atmosphere. The cold, wet city wind rushed in, instantly swallowing the smell of his cologne. Nora stood alone in the ruins of the coffee pot, a $100 bill sticking to the bottom of her ruined shoe, entirely sold to the devil. The morning tasted like exhaust fumes and copper. Nora stood on the cracked concrete of her driveway, clutching a single, scuffed duffel bag. The zipper was broken halfway down, held together by a safety pin. Beside her, Toby shivered in an oversized winter coat that had once belonged to their cousin, kicking at a loose piece of gravel. "Where are we going, No-No?" Toby mumbled, rubbing his eyes. He looked pale, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes. "A friend's house." Nora lied smoothly, the falsehood tasting like ash. "Just for a little while. They have better heating." At exactly 7:59 a.m., a black SUV, so heavily armored it looked like a tank, masquerading as a luxury vehicle, rolled to a silent stop at the curb. The tinted windows were impenetrable. A man in a sharp suit stepped out. He was built like a cinder block, with a thick neck and a broken nose that hadn't healed quite straight. He didn't smile. "Miss Nora," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I'm Luca. Mr. Costa sent me." He reached for her duffel bag. Nora flinched, pulling it back instinctively. Luca stopped, holding his hands up slowly. "Just putting it in the trunk, Ma'am." "I've got it," she said tightly, marching around him and shoving the pathetic bag into the cavernous, pristine trunk. She ushered Toby into the back seat, sliding in beside him. The interior of the car smelled heavily of leather and chemical cleaner. It was silent, a stark contrast to the rattling, noisy bus they usually took. As Luca drove them through the city, watching the decaying brownstones of her neighborhood bleed into the towering glass and steel structures of downtown, Nora felt her pulse thud against her ribs like a trapped bird. City Hall was a brutalist block of concrete. Dominic was waiting on the steps. He wore a different suit today, navy blue, tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. The wind whipped at his dark hair, but he stood entirely motionless, a statue carved out of ice and authority. When he saw the SUV pull up, he descended the stairs. Nora stepped out, telling Toby to wait in the car with Luca. She walked toward Dominic, feeling profoundly inadequate. She wore her only dress, a dark green wrap dress she bought at a thrift store 3 years ago for a funeral. She had scrubbed her face, tied her hair back in a tight knot, and hidden her bruised, coffee-burned ankles in opaque black tights and cheap boots. Dominic's grey eyes swept over her, taking in the frayed hem of her coat, the defensive set of her shoulders, the terrified flutter of her pulse at her throat. "You're late," he said. It was 8:14 a.m. "Traffic." She lied, wrapping her arms around herself. "Do you have the paperwork?" He didn't bother arguing. He gestured for her to follow him inside. "My lawyers have already pre-filed the application. We just need the judge's signature. I expedited the waiting period." "Of course you did," she muttered. The inside of City Hall smelled like floor wax and despair. People milled about, arguing over parking tickets and property taxes. But as Dominic walked through the marble halls, the crowd seemed to part for him. It was a subtle, terrifying phenomenon. No one looked directly at him, but everyone moved out of his way. They reached a set of heavy wooden doors. A clerk was waiting, looking incredibly nervous, sweating through his cheap shirt. "Mr. Costa," the clerk stammered, holding a clipboard. "Everything is ready. Judge Harrison is waiting in his chambers." Dominic didn't look at the clerk. He looked at Nora. "Are you going to vomit?" "Probably," she said honestly, her stomach doing vicious, nauseating somersaults. "But I won't do it on your suit." "Appreciated." He extended his left arm. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a physical command. Nora hesitated for a fraction of a second before slipping her hand through the crook of his arm. Through the thick wool of his sleeve, his muscles felt like coiled steel. She was vibrating with anxiety, while he felt entirely grounded, an immovable object. They stepped into the judge's chambers. It was a blur of dark wood, muttered legal jargon, and the scratching of a fountain pen. "Do you, Dominic, take Nora?" The judge droned, clearly wanting to get this over with as quickly as possible. "I do," Dominic said. His voice didn't waver. "And do you, Nora?" Nora stared at the heavy mahogany desk. She thought about the smell of burnt coffee. She thought about her uncle's leering smile when he told her the house was going to auction. She thought of Toby's ragged breathing at night. She looked up at Dominic. He was staring at her, his expression a blank wall, waiting for her to seal the bargain. "I do," she whispered. "Sign here." The judge pushed the paper forward. Nora picked up the pen. Her hand shook so badly she could barely form the letters of her own name. The ink bled slightly on the heavy parchment. She felt Dominic leaning over her to sign his own name, a bold, slashing signature that took up half the page. The scent of cedarwood washed over her again, making her feel lightheaded. "By the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." The judge mumbled rapidly. "You may kiss the bride." Nora froze. The contract hadn't mentioned a kiss. Dominic turned to her. He didn't lean in. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He flipped it open. Inside sat a diamond so large and cold it looked like a weapon. "Your hand," he ordered softly. She gave it to him. Her fingers were freezing. He slid the ring onto her fourth finger. It was heavy, weighing her hand down. "We skip the kiss," Dominic told the judge, not breaking eye contact with Nora. "We have a schedule to keep." He turned and walked towards the door. Nora stood there for a second, looking at the blinding stone on her finger. She had done it. She was married to the devil. And the hardest part hadn't even begun. Gravel crunched under the heavy tires of the SUV, a rhythmic, bone-rattling sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Nora pressed her forehead against the chilled, tinted glass. The sprawling, decaying grid of the city had given way to high stone walls and wrought-iron gates that opened silently at their approach. Dominic's estate wasn't a house. It was a fortress masquerading as a modern architectural marvel. Slabs of dark slate and floor-to-ceiling glass clung to the edge of a wooded cliff. It looked cold. It looked impenetrable. Toby's breath fogged the window beside her. "Do kings live here?" he whispered, his small fingers tracing the condensation. "Just businessmen, bud," Nora murmured, her chest tight. She rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the knobby ridge of his spine through the thin coat. Luca pulled the SUV into a circular driveway paved with crushed, dark stone. Before the engine even cut completely, the heavy oak front door swung open. A woman with grey hair pulled into a severe, perfect bun stood on the threshold, her hands clasped in front of a charcoal uniform. Dominic didn't wait for Luca to open his door. He stepped out, buttoning his suit jacket in one fluid motion. He didn't look back to see if Nora and Toby were following. He expected it. Nora shoved the heavy door open, hauling Toby out by his hand. The air up here smelled different. Pine needles, wet earth, and an unsettling lack of car exhaust. Luca retrieved their pathetic, broken duffel bag from the trunk. Holding it against his massive frame, the bag looked even more like a piece of garbage. "Mrs. Costa," the housekeeper said as Nora approached the steps. The title felt like a slap. "I am Beatrice, the house manager." "Nora," she corrected automatically, her voice raspy. "Just Nora." Beatrice's eyes flicked to Dominic, who was already halfway across the cavernous foyer, shedding his overcoat. He didn't stop, but his voice echoed off the 30-foot ceiling. "Her name is Nora. Show her to the east wing. Have the kitchen prepare whatever the boy wants. I will be in my study until 6. He disappeared down a long hallway paneled in dark walnut. The heavy thud of a solid door closing sealed him away. Nora stood in the center of the foyer. Her cheap boots squeaked against the polished marble floor. The sheer scale of the space was suffocating. There were no photographs, no clutter, just expensive, angular furniture and the faint, sterile smell of lemon oil and cold air conditioning. "If you'll follow me, Mom," Beatrice said, turning on her sensible heel. They walked in silence. Toby clung to Nora's leg, his eyes wide, taking in the abstract paintings and the towering windows that overlooked a jagged coastline. They passed through a glass-walled corridor and into a separate wing of the house. Beatrice pushed open a double set of doors. "Your rooms. The boys' room connects through the dressing area. Luca will place your luggage inside." Nora stepped in. It was a suite the size of her entire South Side apartment. A king-sized bed dominated the space, covered in stark white linens. The carpet was thick enough to swallow her boots. Through an open archway, she saw a bathroom clad in dark grey stone, complete with a soaking tub that could fit 3 people. "There are fresh clothes in the closet." Beatrice continued smoothly, devoid of any warmth or judgment. "Mr. Costa had a wardrobe brought in this morning based on your approximate measurements. Dinner is served at 8. If you require anything else, pick up the house phone and press 0. Beatrice left, pulling the heavy doors shut with a soft, final click. Nora let go of Toby's hand. She walked over to the edge of the bed and sat down. The mattress didn't even creak. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. She opened her banking app. Available balance, $50,012.43. Her lungs seized. She stared at the glowing green numbers until they blurred. She had done it. The loan sharks were paid off mentally. The house was saved. The trust was secure. She had sold her name, her freedom, and her safety to a man whose eyes looked like a frozen lake. All for a string of digital numbers. "No, no." Toby's small voice broke through the ringing in her ears. He was standing by the massive window, looking out at the ocean. "Are we allowed to touch things?" Nora swallowed the giant lump of terror lodged in her throat. She stood up, forcing her shoulders to relax, forcing the fake, brave smile onto her face that she had perfected over the last 3 years. "Yeah, bug," she said, walking over and ruffling his hair. "We can touch whatever we want. Come on, let's go see if they have macaroni and cheese in that giant kitchen." She had $50,000, and a diamond on her finger so heavy it felt like a shackle. Silk felt wrong against skin that was used to coarse cotton and grease burns. Nora stood perfectly still in the center of her new dressing room. 2 women, tailors Dominic had summoned like genies from a bottle, tugged and pinned a midnight blue evening gown against her ribs. The fabric poured over her hips like liquid glass, the neckline plunging in a sharp V, the back completely exposed to the chilled air of the estate. "Breathe in, please," the older tailor muttered around a mouth full of silver pins. Nora obeyed, her ribs expanding against the unforgiving bodice. She stared at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her hair, usually a frizzy, chaotic mess jammed into a hairnet, had been blown out into sleek, dark waves that cascaded over her bare shoulders. A makeup artist had spent an hour erasing the exhaustion from her face, painting her lips a deep, bruised plum. She looked expensive. She looked like a lie. "Perfect," the tailor said, stepping back. "Mr. Costa has exquisite taste." Nora's stomach twisted. He hadn't asked what she liked. He had simply ordered a weapon for his arsenal, and she was currently wearing it. The door to the dressing room clicked open. Dominic stood in the frame. He wore a tuxedo. It wasn't the rented, stiff kind Nora had seen at high school proms. This was bespoke, the wool so black it seemed to absorb the light in the room, the crisp white shirt drawing attention to the sharp angles of his jaw. He looked lethal. The tailors immediately packed up their kits and scurried out of the room, keeping their eyes trained on the floor. Dominic stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He walked slowly around her, his eyes doing that terrifying, calculating sweep. He was inspecting an investment. "The shoes," he said, his voice flat. Nora shifted her weight, the stiletto heels biting into her battered feet. "They pinch. You will only need to stand for 2 hours," Dominic replied, stepping into her personal space. The smell of cedar and gun oil washed over her, making her heart rate spike. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a long, flat velvet box. He flipped it open. A diamond tennis necklace rested against the black silk lining. "Turn around," he ordered softly. Nora bristled, her jaw tightening, but she turned. She felt his knuckles brush against the sensitive skin of her nape as he draped the heavy stones around her neck. The platinum was ice cold. He fastened the clasp, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second on her spine. A violent shiver racked her body. "We are attending the charity gala for the Children's Hospital," Dominic said, stepping back so she could see herself in the mirror. He stood right behind her reflection. "The entire logistics board will be there. You will smile. You will speak only when spoken to. If someone asks how we met, you tell them we met at an art gallery in Milan 6 months ago." "I've never been to Milan," Nora said, her reflection glaring at his. "Neither has the woman you are pretending to be." Dominic countered smoothly. "Play the part, Nora. Your brother's tutor starts on Monday. Do not make me regret my generosity." The threat wasn't raised in volume, but it echoed like a gunshot. The ride to the city was suffocatingly silent. When the SUV pulled up to the grand entrance of the museum hosting the gala, the flashes of paparazzi cameras immediately strobed through the tinted windows, blindingly bright. "Arm," Dominic commanded. Nora slipped her hand through his elbow as Luca opened the door. The moment their feet hit the red carpet, a wall of noise and light slammed into them. Reporters shouted Dominic's name. They shouted at her, demanding to know who she was, where the notorious bachelor had found a bride. Dominic's posture shifted. The rigid, cold boss vanished. In his place was a man who moved with relaxed, predatory grace. He placed his large hand flat against the bare skin of her lower back, a branding iron of heat. "Smile," he murmured, his breath brushing her ear, looking for all the world like a devoted husband whispering a secret. Nora forced her lips up, her cheek muscles trembling. Inside, the ballroom smelled of roasted truffles, expensive perfume, and aged scotch. It was a sea of jewels and tuxedos. Almost immediately they were intercepted by a group of older men. They all had the same silver hair, the same flush of expensive alcohol on their cheeks, and the same predatory glint in their eyes. "The logistics board." "Dominic?" An older man with a bulbous nose boomed, holding out a glass of champagne. "We read the sudden filing in the municipal registry. We thought it was a clerical error." "No error, Richard," Dominic said smoothly, shaking the man's hand. His grip was entirely firm, dominating the space. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Nora." Richard's eyes slid over Nora. It wasn't the calculating look Dominic gave her. It was oily, invasive. He looked at her collarbones, the plunge of her dress, and finally her eyes. "Well, well," Richard purred, swirling his drink. "She's certainly an upgrade from the usual company we see you with, Dominic. Tell me, my dear, what does one do to catch the eye of the city's most dangerous bachelor?" Nora felt Dominic's hand tighten imperceptibly on her spine. A warning. She looked at Richard. She thought about the men who used to sit at the diner counter and demand free pie because they left a $2 tip. Bullies always wore the same face, whether they wore stained denim or Tom Ford tuxedos. "I didn't try to catch it," Nora said, her voice dropping the polite, high-pitched register she had been practicing, settling into her natural South Side rasp. "He caught mine." Richard blinked, surprised by the rough texture of her voice. "Is that so? And what were you doing before Dominic swept you away to his fortress?" "Working," Nora replied deadpan. "I find that keeping busy prevents me from asking inappropriate questions at charity events." Silence dropped over the small circle of men. Richard's face flushed a deep, ugly red. For a split second, Nora was terrified she had just ruined the $50 million merger. She braced herself for Dominic to drag her away by her wrist. Instead, a low, dark sound rumbled in Dominic's chest. A chuckle. He stepped half an inch closer to her, his hand sliding from her lower back to grip the curve of her hip possessively. "My wife," Dominic said, his eyes locking onto Richard with a terrifying, absolute zero chill, "does not suffer fools. It is one of the many reasons I married her. Now, if you'll excuse us, Richard, the champagne here is giving her a headache." He didn't wait for a response. He steered Nora away, cutting through the crowd like a shark through a school of guppies. He didn't stop until they reached a secluded balcony overlooking the city skyline. The cold night air hit Nora's bare back, instantly raising goosebumps. She pulled away from his grip, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. "I'm sorry," she blurted out, wrapping her arms around her stomach. "I know I was supposed to be quiet, but he was looking at me like I was a piece of meat on a butcher's block, and I just—" "Stop talking." Dominic cut in. He turned to face her in the dim light of the balcony. The street lamps far below illuminated the harsh angles of his face. He reached up, slowly, telegraphing the movement. Nora forced herself not to flinch. He didn't hit her. He unclasped his tuxedo jacket, sliding it off his shoulders, and draped it over hers. The heavy wool was radiating his body heat. It smelled intensely of his skin and cedar. "You didn't ruin anything," Dominic said quietly, looking out at the city below. "Richard is a parasite. If you had cowered, he would have smelled blood in the water and voted against the merger just to assert dominance. You bit back." Nora pulled the lapels of the jacket closer together, her hands trembling. "You're not mad?" Dominic finally looked at her. His grey eyes were unreadable, deep and shadowed. "I don't get mad, Nora. I get leverage. You just gave me leverage over the chairman of the board by publicly humiliating him. You did your job." It was a compliment, wrapped in barbed wire. Nora looked away, staring at the blinking red lights of a distant airplane. "Right, transactional. I remember." They stood in silence for 10 minutes on the balcony. For the first time since she signed the papers, Nora didn't feel entirely like prey. She felt like an accomplice, and she wasn't sure which was worse. The adrenaline crash hit her at exactly 2 a.m. Nora sat on the edge of the massive bathtub in her suite, a wet washcloth pressed to her eyes. She had scrubbed the plum lipstick off until her mouth was raw and swollen. The midnight blue dress was discarded on the floor, looking like a murdered shadow. She wore a pair of oversized grey sweatpants she had found in the back of the closet, and a faded white t-shirt she had smuggled in her duffel bag. Her feet were throbbing in agonizing rhythm with her pulse. The stilettos had rubbed her heels raw, the blisters weeping clear fluid. She tossed the washcloth into the sink and limped out of the bathroom. The suite was too quiet. The silence in this house wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of her lungs. At the diner, there was always the hum of the fridge, the rattle of a passing truck. Here, there was nothing. Her throat was parched. Nora crept out of her suite. easing the heavy door shut so it wouldn't click. She navigated the dark, cavernous hallways by memory, sliding her socked feet over the cold marble to minimize the noise. The kitchen was a stainless steel monstrosity, gleaming under the faint moonlight pouring through the skylight. It looked more like a surgical theater than a place to cook. She found a glass in a cupboard and turned on the tap, wincing as the water hit the metal basin with a sharp hiss. She drank greedily, the cold water soothing her dry throat. "You're limping." Nora dropped the glass. It hit the stainless steel sink, miraculously not shattering, but creating a deafening clatter. She spun around, her heart launching itself into her throat. Dominic was sitting at the massive granite island in the dark. He had discarded the tuxedo jacket and the bow tie. The top 3 buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. In the pale moonlight, Nora could see the jagged, pale lines of old scars crisscrossing his thick forearms. A glass of amber liquid sat untouched in front of him. "Do you make a habit of creeping around in the dark to give people heart attacks?" Nora gasped, clutching her chest. Dominic didn't move. "This is my house. I don't creep. I was sitting here when you walked in." Nora leaned against the sink, trying to regulate her breathing. "Right, sorry, I just needed water." "Your ankle," Dominic said, his gaze dropping to her feet. "It was injured before the shoes." It wasn't a question. He had noticed her slight hesitation on the stairs at the gala. "I twisted it," Nora muttered, defensive. "When I dropped the coffee pot, at the diner, it's fine." Dominic stood up. He moved silently for a man of his size. He walked to a sleek, hidden cabinet built into the wall, opened it, and pulled out a white plastic first aid kit. He brought it over to the island and set it down. "Sit," he ordered, pointing to one of the high stools. "I said I'm fine." "And I said sit." His voice didn't rise, but the absolute authority in it made her legs move before her brain could argue. She hobbled over and climbed onto the stool, feeling incredibly small and foolish in her baggy sweatpants. Dominic crouched in front of her. He didn't ask for permission. He took her right foot in his large hand, his thumb resting gently against her instep. His hands were incredibly warm. Nora tensed, her breath hitching. "What are you doing?" "Fixing a liability," Dominic said smoothly, though he didn't look up at her. He popped the latch on the kit and pulled out a roll of athletic tape and a small tube of ointment. "If you limp at the charity brunch on Sunday, people will ask questions. I don't like questions." He rolled the hem of her sweatpants up to her mid-calf. His fingers brushed the bruised, swollen skin around her ankle bone. He was surprisingly gentle, probing the joint with expert precision. "Not broken," he murmured. "Sprained." He opened the ointment and dabbed it onto the raw blisters on her heel from the stilettos, before smoothly wrapping her ankle in a tight, supportive figure 8 of white tape. Nora stared down at the top of his dark head. She could see the faint exhaustion pulling at the corners of his eyes, the tight clench of his jaw. He was a man who ordered people ruined before breakfast, yet he was currently kneeling on a cold kitchen floor, taping up a waitress's ankle. The contradiction made her head spin. "Why do you need this?" Nora asked softly, the silence of the room pulling the truth out of her. "The logistics company, the merger. You have more money than God. You run this city. Why pretend to be a corporate suit?" Dominic finished taping her ankle. He secured the end, his hand lingering for a moment on her calf. He didn't pull away immediately, because power based on fear has an expiration date, Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble in the quiet kitchen. He looked up, his grey eyes locking onto hers. The emptiness she had seen in the diner was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fire. There is always someone younger, hungrier, and more violent waiting to take your place. You survive by evolving, by building walls made of legitimate paper and corporate lawyers instead of bullets and blood. He stood up, towering over her again. He picked up the first aid kit and snapped it shut. "I am securing a future," Dominic added, walking back to the cabinet. "One that cannot be bled out on a sidewalk." Nora looked at her taped ankle. It felt incredibly supported, the throbbing pain already dulling into a background ache. She thought about Toby, asleep in a bed that cost more than her life. She was securing a future too. They were both just trying to survive their respective wars. "Thank you," Nora said quietly, looking at her hands. "For the ankle." Dominic paused at the doorway, the shadows of the hall already swallowing him. "Go to sleep, Nora," he said, and for the first time, his voice didn't sound like a command. It sounded dangerously human. "Tomorrow we buy you a wedding ring." Rain lashed against the bulletproof windows of the SUV, distorting the city lights into angry, red and yellow smears. Nora sat in the back, picking at the fraying edge of her thumbnail. Toby was asleep, his head resting against her thigh, a faint wheeze whistling through his parted lips. Dominic sat across from them, tapping something out on an encrypted tablet. He hadn't spoken since they left the estate. The vehicle idled to a stop in front of a storefront on Fifth Avenue. There were no other cars on the block. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement like spilled oil. A man in a heavy raincoat stood by the entrance of the jewelry store, flipping a closed sign to open, just for them. "Wake him up," Dominic ordered, slipping the tablet into his briefcase. "Leave him!" Nora shot back, her protective instincts flaring. "It's freezing out there. I know my ring size. You don't need a prop to buy a piece of metal." Dominic paused, his hand resting on the chrome door handle. He looked at Toby's sleeping face, then up at Nora. The harsh neon light from the street painted half his face in shadow. "He stays in the car with Luca. The doors lock from the inside. He won't be disturbed." Nora hesitated, looking at Luca's massive, unmoving silhouette in the driver's seat. She nodded once. Stepping onto the pavement, the wind immediately bit through her thin trench coat. Dominic didn't offer his jacket this time, but he did walk on the outside of the sidewalk, shielding her from the worst of the biting wind. Inside, the jewelry store smelled like ozone, heavily polished glass, and desperate obsequiousness. The manager, a balding man sweating through a silk tie, practically vibrated with nervous energy as Dominic crossed the threshold. "Mr. Costa, an honor, truly. I have the private room prepared." "Out here is fine, Arthur," Dominic said, his voice stripping the warmth out of the room. "Show us the wedding bands." Velvet trays were hauled out of the vault with frantic speed. Diamonds the size of crushed ice, platinum bands encrusted with emeralds, ostentatious displays of wealth that made Nora's stomach churn. It all looked like blood money. "Choose," Dominic said, leaning his hip against the glass counter. He didn't look at the rings. He looked at her. Nora stared down at the glittering velvet. "They're too much. I can't wear these to—" She stopped herself. She didn't work at the diner anymore. She didn't have a life to go back to. "To what?" Dominic prodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You are Mrs. Costa. You don't wash dishes anymore, Nora." "I know what I am," she snapped, a sudden spike of anger cutting through her exhaustion. She pointed to a thin, completely unadorned band of solid yellow gold in the corner of the display. "That one." Arthur the jeweler paled. "Ma'am, that is a standard, base level. I want that one," Nora repeated, looking directly into Dominic's grey eyes. "It's practical. It won't catch on anything. And it looks like an actual marriage, not a hostile corporate takeover." A muscle feathered in Dominic's jaw. He held her gaze for a long, heavy 10 seconds. The silence in the store was deafening. Arthur looked like he was preparing to write his own will. Slowly, Dominic reached out and picked up the plain gold band. He took Nora's left hand. His grip was firm, inescapable. He slid the ring over her knuckle, right beneath the massive engagement diamond. The gold was cold, but his skin was burning. Practical. Dominic murmured, his thumb brushing over the pulse point on her wrist. His heart rate was completely steady. Hers was a frantic, trapped bird. "Wrap it up, Arthur. Add it to the account." He didn't buy a ring for himself. The contract didn't require him to wear the shackles, only her. As they walked back to the SUV, the rain turning into a sleety mix, Nora rubbed her thumb against the smooth gold. It was light. It felt entirely insignificant compared to the diamond above it. But as she climbed into the car and saw Toby sleeping peacefully under Luca's watchful eye, she realized the gold band was the heaviest thing she had ever worn. It was the price of her brother's life. 3 days before the logistics merger was set to close, the illusion shattered. Nora was in the sunroom, attempting to read a thick hardcover novel she'd pulled from the library, though she hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. Toby was on the carpet, building a sprawling, chaotic city out of expensive wooden blocks Beatrice had procured. A sharp, violent crack echoed through the glass walls. Nora flinched, the book dropping from her lap. It sounded like a firecracker, but growing up on the south side, she knew the dry, popping sound of a small-caliber gunshot when she heard it. "Toby!" she hissed, dropping to her knees and grabbing the collar of his shirt. "Under the sofa. Now, don't make a sound." Toby's eyes were wide, terrified, but he scrambled under the heavy velvet furniture without a word. Nora pressed herself flat against the floorboards, her heart hammering against her ribs, tasting the familiar, bitter copper of adrenaline. Shouting erupted from the front courtyard. Nora crawled towards the edge of the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing her cheek against the cold glass to peek through the frost-tipped hedges. Down in the crushed stone driveway, Luca was on the ground, blood pooling around his knee. 2 men in cheap leather jackets were dragging a third man toward the front doors. Nora felt the breath get punched out of her lungs. The third man was her uncle, Frank. His face was bruised, a panicked, sweating mess. The man holding him by the collar had a gun pointed directly at Luca's head. "Costa!" The man with the gun screamed, his voice cracking with meth-fueled desperation. "I know you're in there. Your new piece of tail owes my boss 50 grand, and this piece of trash—" He shook Frank violently, said she married the deepest pockets in the city. "Open the door!" Nora's stomach hollowed out. Frank had sold her out. He had gone to the loan sharks to cover his own debts, pointing them straight at the estate. The heavy oak front doors swung open. Dominic stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore dark slacks and a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He didn't carry a weapon. He walked out onto the granite steps with the slow, terrifying inevitability of a glacier. "You shot my driver," Dominic said. The volume of his voice was completely conversational. It carried over the wind, chilling Nora to her marrow. "I'll shoot you if you don't pay up," the junkie screamed, waving the gun frantically. 50 grand, cash, or we tell the papers that the great Dominic Costa married a gutter rat running from the mob." Dominic didn't stop walking. He descended the stairs, his eyes locked on the gun. "Dominic, don't!" Nora screamed, pounding her fists against the glass. The sound was swallowed by the thick, bulletproof panes. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Dominic didn't flinch as the gun tracked toward his chest. He lunged. It was a movement of pure, unfiltered brutality. He grabbed the barrel of the gun, forcing it upward as it fired, the bullet shattering a stone gargoyle above the door. With his other hand, Dominic struck the man's throat. A sickening crunch echoed across the courtyard. The man dropped like a stone, clutching his crushed windpipe, choking on his own blood. The second man pulled a knife, lunging forward. Dominic pivoted, catching the man's wrist. He twisted sharply. The crack of bone was louder than the gunshot. The man screamed, dropping the blade, and Dominic followed through with a brutal driving kick to the man's knee, shattering the joint. Frank fell to his knees in the gravel, sobbing, raising his hands in surrender. Dominic stood amongst the groaning bodies, entirely unscathed. He looked down at Frank, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying apathy. He pulled a cell phone from his pocket and pressed a single button. "Clean this up." Dominic ordered the receiver. "Take the uncle to the docks. Put him on a freighter to Manila. If he ever sets foot in this hemisphere again, drown him." Nora scrambled back from the window, pressing her hands over her mouth to muffle a sob. She was shaking violently. She had known he was a monster. She had known what he did. But seeing it, seeing the casual, effortless destruction of human life, shattered the polite, corporate illusion they had been living in. The sunroom doors swung open. Dominic stood in the threshold. He had a smear of blood across his cheekbone. He looked at Nora curled on the floor, and then at the small pair of sneakers visible under the sofa. The lethal, cold energy radiating from him hitched for a fraction of a second. "Is the boy hurt?" he asked, his voice low and tight. Nora shook her head, unable to speak, staring at the blood on his knuckles. Dominic closed his eyes for a brief moment. "Luca will take you to the penthouse in the city. You stay there until the police have come and gone. It will be classified as an attempted robbery." He turned to leave, shutting the door on the monster he couldn't hide from her anymore. 10 months later, the logistics merger had gone through flawlessly. Dominic Costa was now the majority shareholder of a completely legitimate empire. The blood was washed from the marble, the loan sharks were quiet, and the media had crowned them the city's most reclusive, powerful couple. Nora stood in the doorway of Dominic's study. The clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight. It was a Tuesday, exactly 1 year since the diner. Dominic was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, a glass of scotch untouched at his elbow. He was reading a legal document, his reading glasses making him look older, sharper. He didn't look up as she entered. "The trust funds have been fully transferred to your private account, Nora. Arthur Penhaligon finalized the paperwork this afternoon. You are officially wealthy." Nora stepped onto the Persian rug. She wore a simple grey sweater and worn jeans. The heavy diamond engagement ring was gone, sitting in a velvet box on her dresser upstairs. But the thin gold band was still on her finger. "I know," she said, her voice quiet. "I saw the wire transfer." Dominic finally looked up, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked exhausted. The transition to corporate life hadn't softened him, but it had drained him. "The divorce papers are in the top drawer," Dominic said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. It was the same tone he had used in the diner. Transactional, cold, irreconcilable differences. "I will take the public blame. The estate in the Hamptons is yours, as agreed. The security detail for Toby will remain on my payroll indefinitely." He waited. He expected her to take the out. He expected her to run, just like she had wanted to 10 months ago. Nora walked slowly across the room. She stopped in front of his desk, placing her hands flat on the polished wood. "Toby asked me yesterday if you were coming to his soccer game on Saturday," Nora said, her voice shaking slightly, but holding firm. Dominic flinched. It was microscopic, but she saw it. "Tell him I have a board meeting. I told him you'd be there." She countered, her chin tilting up. "Nora!" Dominic warned, a low, dangerous rumble in his chest. "The contract is over. You have your money. You have your safety. Go." "Where?" she asked, dropping the mask entirely. The raw, desperate girl from the South Side bled through. "To a massive empty house in the Hamptons? To sit around and pretend I didn't spend the last year watching a monster try to be human for the sake of an 8-year-old boy? Dominic stood up abruptly, the heavy leather chair scraping violently against the floor. He leaned over the desk, invading her space, smelling of scotch and cedar and danger. "I am not human, Nora." He snarled, the civilized veneer cracking, revealing the violent king underneath. "You saw what I did in the courtyard. You know what I am capable of. I am a cage. I bought you." "And I sold myself!" She shot back, stepping closer instead of backing away. She reached out, her small, calloused fingers grabbing the lapel of his crisp shirt. "You bought me, but you never treated me like property. You taped my ankle. You kept the blood away from my brother. You gave me the only safe place I've ever known." Dominic's breathing turned ragged. He stared down at her, his grey eyes warring with an emotion he clearly didn't know how to process. He raised his hand, his large fingers hovering inches from her cheek, afraid to touch her. "If you stay," he whispered, the sound torn from his throat. "I will never let you leave. The divorce papers burn tonight. You understand me? There is no second exit." Nora looked at the jagged scar on his eyebrow. She thought of the cold, terrifying world outside these walls. She thought of the way she actually slept through the night when she knew he was awake down the hall. She didn't want romance. She wanted a partner who could fight the monsters in the dark. "Burn them," Nora said, her voice a rough, absolute certainty. Dominic didn't hesitate. He closed the distance, his hands gripping her face, kissing her with a violent, possessive desperation that tasted like scotch and survival. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't perfect. But as Nora kissed him back, anchoring her hands in his hair, it was the most honest thing either of them had ever done. If you felt the tension in this raw, unconventional Mafia romance, hit that like button. Nora and Dominic's story proves that sometimes the darkest bargains lead to the fiercest loyalties. Love isn't always flowers and apologies. Sometimes it's a gold band and a locked door. What did you think of Dominic's brutal protection? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with fellow dark romance readers. Ring the bell for more gripping, gritty storytelling, and stay tuned for our next intense audio drama.